So far, we have had the following books as part of this series. Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird, led by Cynthia Jones, faculty member in the Washington College of Law. Jacob Reese's How the Other Half Lives, led by Pam Nadal, who is chair of the history department here. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, led by Tom Merrill, who is an assistant professor in the government department. Benjamin Franklin's Experiments and Observations on Electricity, led by the chairman of the physics department, Nathan Harshman. This one always makes me smile because he kept creating electricity and shocking himself. And so we were all worried that we were not going to have a department chair by the next day. Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, led by Louis Grossman, another professor at the Washington College of Law. He was subsequently invited by the Library of Congress to do his same talk at the Law Library of Congress for a group of lawyers on Capitol Hill and sort of that community. Last November, I led the talk on Fahrenheit 451, which seemed to be a natural for a librarian to do. I also want to tell you what's coming up, and then I will introduce Carola. On February the 18th, Kyle Dargan, who is the director of the MFA program in creative writing, will be leading us in a discussion of James Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time. On April the 1st, we have Patrick Jackson, who's the Associate Dean of the School of International Service, for the book Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Hyman. And on April 22nd, the book will be Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, led by Yima Mehta, assistant professor, also from the School of Professional and Extended Studies. And tonight, we have the Dean of the School of Professional and Extended Studies, Carola Weil, as our discussion leader. The books that we are reading for this series, remember, are not the best, they're not the most award-winning, but they're books that, through conversations like ours,
book handoff,
have shaped America over time. So Carola came to the university last September and came as the Dean of the School of Professional Extended Studies. Prior to that, she held multiple appointments at the University of Southern California, the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. Carola is a scholar in international affairs, armed conflict, human security, and has held appointments in international relations and public diplomacy at USC, at George Washington University, and the Harvard School, the Kennedy School at Harvard. She holds a BA in history from Bryn Mawr, a master's in public administration, and a PhD in political science, both from the University of Maryland. She's also a wonderful colleague. With that, I introduce to you Carola Weil.
Thank you very much. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I will use my classroom voice, but I am delighted to be here to share with you a book that I read a long time ago when I was in school as a student, and at the time read it with a very different view. At the time I was studying American history. I was studying history of the Americas writ large. I was focused on questions of citizenship and migration and race relations. And as I was thinking about this book series, it occurred to me that there is another way in which we can be thinking about the work of W.E.B. Du Bois and this particular book, The Souls of Black Folk. And so I'm going to shift tracks a little bit and not focus as much on the more traditional reading, which is one about race in America, although of course that is central to this topic, and really think about W.E.B. Du Bois as a scholar and as an advocate of higher education. And in a particular context as an advocate of higher education, that argues that we need not just the training, the technical training of individuals, but we need the opening of minds. And it seemed to be an appropriate way to set the story for here. So why did I choose this particular book? For several reasons. As an educator and someone who has spent, and I should say, I'm very embarrassed to say, I have 2 copies of the book and I left both of them in my car. So we had to borrow one from the library. It's a wonderful edition and you should check it out if you can. As an educator and someone who has spent her lifetime thinking about the meaning of citizenship or the lack thereof, I was drawn to the ideas of Du Bois on these topics. I was also drawn to the book as a social scientist. Du Bois's contribution to our knowledge as a sociologist, an economist, and a historian have been seminal in the understanding of American society. And the fact that he happened to have been African American and he was a scholar of color is really tangential to the contributions that he has made to the discipline of sociology. I also came to appreciate Du Bois for personal reasons. As I read more about Du Bois's life and work, I discovered that we actually had much more in common than I thought. Germany. I'm from Germany. Du Bois spent 2 years as an exchange student in Berlin and elsewhere in Europe and was heavily influenced by some of the major philosophers, scientists, and writers of the day, including the famed sociologist Max Weber. Ghana. I lived in Ghana for a number of years. Du Bois found an affinity with the country and its leader, Kwame Nkrumah, as the first post-colonial independent nation on the African continent. Eventually, in fact, renouncing his US citizenship for Ghanaian. And he spent his last 2 years of his life in Ghana, where he died at the age of 94 in 1963. Very impressive lifespan. Harvard. I only dabbled in Harvard, I should say. I was there as a postdoctoral fellow and teaching fellow. Du Bois was the first African American to receive a PhD from Harvard in 1885, after having already earned a BA at Fisk University and a second BA and an MA at Harvard. And finally, we share in common a love of Hegel. And I grant you that that's probably a little geeky, but I wrote my senior thesis on Hegelian dialectic. And it is clear that Du Bois's idea of a double consciousness, which comes out throughout the book, Souls of Black Folk, is very much derived from his reading of Hegel and other philosophers in that vein. It also shifted Du Bois from someone who had been his critical mentor at Harvard, William James, the philosopher and pragmatist William James. So when we think about reading Souls of Black Folks, there are a couple of key concepts that I just want to make sure that we all have an understanding of, because they are fundamental. He refers to them all the time, and they are fundamental to any discussion around Du Bois. Souls of Black Folk was published in 1903 as a set of essays, some of which had previously been published in other versions in magazines. By this time, Du Bois was a major scholar and social scientist with an international reputation. He was recognized widely as one of the nation's most educated citizens, leading scholar of Black life in the US. He authored the seminal so-called Philadelphia study, which actually collected data on the day-to-day life of African Americans in Philadelphia. When he had his teaching appointment in Atlanta, he then replicated the study and gathered a tremendous amount of data, some of it for the first time around the African American population of Atlanta and the South. He was convinced of the role that reason, the social sciences, and academic research might play. We also need to think about the context in which he wrote this book. At that time, separate but equal had become law. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, which allowed state-sponsored segregation, had passed and had called into life the Jim Crow era. We had the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, mass lynchings and indentured servitude of Southern Black farm workers. We also had the personal tragedy and experiences that Du Bois had to live with at that time. He lost his son due to the denial of medical attention by a white doctor who refused to treat his son. He also was influenced by a very early childhood experience, which often is referred to as the schoolhouse story, and in fact there is a version of that in Obama's own, President Obama's own memoirs. And I'll just briefly quote from Souls. "It is in the early days of rollicking boyhood that the revelation first burst upon one, all in a day, as it were. I remember well when the shadow swept across me. I was a little thing, away up in the hills of New England, where the dark Housatonic winds between Hoosac and Taconic to the sea. In a wee wooden schoolhouse, something put into the boys' and girls' heads to buy gorgeous visiting cards, 10 cents a package, and exchange. The exchange was merry, till one girl, a tall newcomer, refused my card. Refused it peremptorily, with a glance. Then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from others, or like, mayhap, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil." That is the veil that he refers to repeatedly. The veil in this context refers to, sorry, I just lost my place. It refers to the life of African Americans behind the color line. It refers to the difference, to the segregation. The essays contained in the 14 chapters of Souls reflect these studies, but also introduce a basic vocabulary for the understanding of the African American experience behind this veil. And I would argue that that view has influenced discussions of African American experiences to this day. It certainly was one of the motivators behind the leaders of the civil rights movement, and had he lived long enough, I'm sure he would have been side by side with Martin Luther King and many other figures in the civil rights movement. Double consciousness was another key concept that he proposed in this book to describe the combined sense of national identity as an American, but also of belonging to a racial identity that was vilified and rejected by that very nation, and which forced Black individuals to see themselves primarily through the lens of a white America. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and the Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with a second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. And finally, he talks to us about the talented tenth. This was a term that was used quite frequently at the time. The founder of Morehouse College is said to have originally coined the phrase. There are others who say it was a northern white academic who came up with the term, but it clearly influenced the way in which Du Bois thought about leadership and the relationship of education and leadership. It referred to the educated elites of African Americans who were and could lead their brethren. He later disavowed this theory, but it is important to understand this particular book. Here then, he says, is the plain thirst for training. By refusing to give this talented tenth the key to knowledge, can any sane man imagine that they will lightly lay aside their yearning and contentedly become hewers of wood and drawers of water? He also spoke about the talented tenth in another book, an essay that he wrote, The Negro Problem, published the same year, where he points out that the problem of education then among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race that they may guide the mass away from contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races. Now, the training of men is a difficult and intricate task. Its technique is a matter for educational experts, us. But its object is for the vision of seers. If we make money the object of man training, we shall develop money makers, but not necessarily men. If we make technical skill the object of education, we may possess artisans, but not in nature men. Men we shall have only as we make manhood the object of the work of schools. Intelligence, broad sympathy, knowledge of the world that was and is, and of the relation of men to it. This is the curriculum of that higher education which must underlie true life. Another interesting facet of the souls of black souls is that each chapter is introduced by a stanza of poetry or text. And I've chosen here the introduction to chapter 6, which begins with a poem, one stanza of a poem by Omar Khayyam. Why, if the soul can fling the dust aside and naked on the air of heaven ride, were it not a shame for him in this clay carcass crippled to abide? And he chose an interesting piece of music. Now, I would love to impress you by saying that I was able to read that and immediately determine what it was. Unfortunately, I don't know how to read music anymore. But someone else had, in fact, done a study of all of his music. And it turns out that this is a well-known spiritual called March On.
Where on in Egypt's land you shall gain the victory. Where over in Egypt's land where the people march on, Lord, and you will gain the victory. March, march, my brother, Lord, you want it.
So to me, I wondered, well, why would you use this music and why would you use this stanza to talk about the training of black men, which is the topic of this chapter? And it seems to me that it suggests perhaps an inherent linkage between the political and civil rights that are invoked by the song and by Omar Khayyam's work with education. So why should we care about either this treatise or Du Bois today? One, we just passed the 50th anniversary of his death, so there's a good excuse to think about him again. And in fact, last year, if you were paying any attention at all to what was going on at other universities, I don't think there was a single academic institution that didn't have a Du Bois symposium going somewhere or another. So it's appropriate to commemorate. But more importantly, I believe it echoes deeply our current discussions around the role of education and particularly higher education in civil society. A central element of this book was a debate that took place between the noted leader of the time, African-American leader, Booker T. Washington, who also was the founder of the Tuskegee Normal School, which eventually became Tuskegee University, and W.E.B. Du Bois. And let me just, if you will bear with me, I want to, if I can get to it, This is going to be high tech. Just very quickly play for you. Can't get it up enough. Oops. Well, I may not be able to get to the screen, won't. Yeah, I can't get it to, I need it to move up, but I tried. Oh, maybe it will now. Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yes? We must have lost the internet connection. No?
No, you're okay. It's just loading up.
You can hit that arrow right
Yeah,
there, right there.
no.
It's still loading.
Let's see.
Could get.
Okay, there we go.
Purple
Sorry.
is the first day of the rest of your life.
You got a little
It's a
hat.
second chance.
Can everyone hear?
No.
One of the first moments where Du Bois comes onto the national stage is the brewing controversy between his ideas about racial progress and how to move the race forward, and the leading African American figure of that time period, the late 19th and early 20th century, Booker T. Washington. In the beginning, they agreed on many points about the importance of education and moving the race forward. It turns out, though, that because Du Bois was northern born and had access to some of the best schools in New England and really was encouraged to think broadly, it's been part of his elite graduate education, being trained in Berlin, working with Max Weber. By contrast to Booker T. Washington, who was self-educated, a very gifted and talented man, but he was born as a slave. That fundamental difference certainly shaped their sense of change over time. The life that Booker T. Washington eventually led as the leading, most recognized figure of African American society meant that his expectations for what the white race was willing to do on behalf of black people were very different than of Du Bois. You could say Du Bois was a utopian idealist in some respects, and Booker T. Washington was a pragmatist, better known as an accommodationist. And so it set up an ongoing debate. Eventually, Booker T. Washington's program sustained the ethos of Jim Crow America because it was about black people working, but on white people's terms. It was about a lack of political enfranchisement because white people were subject to poll taxes and literacy tests and the inability to vote. And it was ultimately about a form of second-class citizenship that was segregated America. In this regard, Du Bois did see that real change, fundamental change, living up to the real promises of racial democracy in America depended upon agitation, depended upon a grasp of power.
Yes. There we go. Back to that. So what the debate between Washington and Du Bois fundamentally became one of thinking about education as a path to career, to economic well-being, to wealth, or one of empowerment, enlightenment, self-enrichment, and civil engagement and civil rights. As Du Bois notes in Chapter 3 of Souls, he was concerned about the triumphant commercialism and the ideals of material prosperity. Mr. Washington's program naturally takes an economic cast, becoming a gospel of work and money, to such an extent as apparently almost entirely overshadowing the higher aims of life. It has been claimed that the Negro can survive only through submission. Mr. Washington distinctly asked that black people give up, at least for the present, 3 things. First, political power. Second, insistence on civil rights. Third, higher education of Negro youth. And concentrate all their energies on industrial education. To this, Du Bois answers, is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men? If history and reason give any distinct answer to these questions, it is an emphatic no. Beyond noting that without university-trained teachers, there could not have been the kind of technical and common school infrastructure that Washington and others built on in the South, he also took issue with what he perceived to see as a flawed dichotomy between training for work and what we would call a liberal arts education. Teach thinkers to think, a needed knowledge in a day of loose and careless logic, and they whose lot is gravest must have the carefulest training to think aright. If these things are so, how foolish to ask what is the best education for 1 or 7 or 60 million souls. Shall we teach them trades or train them in liberal arts? Neither and both. Teach the workers to work and the thinkers to think. Make carpenters of carpenters and philosophers of philosophers and fops of fools. Nor can we pause here. We are training not isolated men, but a living group of men, nay, a group within a group. And the final product of our training must be neither a psychologist nor a bricksman, but a man. You will notice that there is no mention of women. Many feminists have written about Du Bois. That is a whole nother talk. And there has been a lot of discussion about how we should take the term men. I will give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that he's referring to it as a mankind. But in fact, he was in his personal life, actually quite a chauvinistic gentleman of the old school for those of us who care about these issues. He does acknowledge that institutions of higher education are far from perfect. They are not a panacea, but they perform an important socializing as well as educational function. Interestingly, even as he criticizes the technical training approach for its lack of focus on civil and political rights, he does also comment on the inherently conservative nature of the talented 10th, those who are structuring and running the universities, and the institutions that produce them. With all their larger vision and deeper sensibility, these men have usually been conservative, careful leaders. They have seldom been agitators, have withstood the temptation to head the mob, and have worked steadily and faithfully in 1,000 communities. But as he goes on to explain, it is learning and appreciation of higher things in the broadest sense, the creation of broad-minded individuals, that will unite and strengthen a society divided by racism and inequality. Transformation, he says, calls for singular vision and wisdom, singular wisdom and patience. If, while the healing of this vast sore is progressing, the races are to live for many years side by side, united in economic effort, obeying a common government, sensitive to mutual thought and feeling, yet subtly and silently separate in many matters of deeper human intimacy, if this unusual and dangerous development is to progress amid peace and order, mutual respect and growing intelligence, it will call for social surgery, at once the delicatest and nicest in modern history. It will demand broad-minded, upright men, both white and black, and in its final accomplishment, American civilization will triumph. So let us fast forward. Just in the past year, and indeed this past month, the role of higher education has taken the stage front and center once again. Alas, not always in a positive light. Much is said about college debt and the rising cost of education. Did you know that education now is a more significant investment for most families than owning a home? And yet, there is also heightened recognition that now more than ever we need higher education as a prerequisite for economic and social well-being. Indeed, the discussion now extends well beyond the talented 10th. As was recently quoted in a White House press release, earning a post-secondary degree or credential is no longer just a pathway to opportunity for a talented few. Sound familiar? Rather, it is a prerequisite for the growing jobs of the new economy. And just last week, the White House, under the leadership of First Lady Michelle Obama, convened a summit on education to follow up on a call for action to reduce inequality in access to higher education and help, quote, every hardworking kid go to college and succeed when they get to campus. This was a call issued by the White House last fall, and again, for those of you who listened to the State of the Union address, probably heard it there as well. In the report that was issued by the White House for the Education Summit, one of the points that they identify as a priority is to improve college opportunity because it is important to increasing economic mobility and growing the economy. Without college, a child born in the bottom quintile has only a 5% chance of making it to the top quintile. However, the chance of making it to the top nearly quadruples with a college degree, with a nearly equal chance of making it to the top quintile as staying in the bottom quintile. Yet only 9% of those born in the bottom quartile attain a bachelor's degree by age 25, compared to 54% in the top. Improving college success is one of the most powerful tools to increase economic mobility and reduce inequality. So I wonder, though, what would Du Bois say about this emphasis on economics, on training? Interestingly enough, this past Tuesday's State of the Union address, President Obama focused much of his discussion regarding education on workforce readiness training. As he noted, taking a page from that playbook, the White House has just organized a College Opportunity Summit where already 150 universities, businesses, and nonprofits have made concrete commitments to reduce inequality in access to higher education and help hardworking kids go to college. So tonight, I've asked Vice President Biden to lead an across-the-board reform of America's training programs to make sure they have one mission: train Americans with the skill employers need and match them to good jobs that need to be filled right now. That means more on-the-job training and more apprenticeships that set a young worker on an upward trajectory for life. More ready-to-work Americans with ready-to-be-filled jobs. So I will ask again, what would Du Bois have said in response? And I would suggest that some of what we're trying to do here at American University is very much to combine the two, to get back to the Du Boisian ideal of neither the psychologist nor the bricksman, but in fact a combination of both man and woman in this case. As he notes, there must come a loftier respect for the sovereign human soul that seeks to know itself and the world about it, that seeks a freedom for expansion and self-development, that will love and hate and labor in its own way, untrammeled alike by old and new. And that is how he thought about higher education. Remember those trading cards that he didn't get at the beginning in that wee wooden schoolhouse? Well, he's now on the theory.org UK trading card, so I just thought I would put that on. Souls of Black Folk and its author had a profound impact, as I mentioned, not just on race relations, but on setting the stage for a whole new understanding of society. One that was based in hard fact and data on the one hand, but also one that strove to rise beyond those facts, to bring light to, as the last chapter of this book is called, The Songs of Sorrow. He may have been focused on the color line, but in fact, I would suggest that perhaps these are universal truths and challenges. So what do you think? Thoughts, comments? Higher education, is it about training? Is there a place for liberal arts?
It's not just liberal arts, it's also organizing, protesting, growth, standing up for what's important. And Obama is much more like Booker T. Washington than he is like Du Bois, which is a great disappointment to me. And
Well,
would
when
be to Du Bois.
Yes, please.
It seems that a democracy is predicated on an electorate that can make critical decisions and that it can do what we try to teach our students here, and that is to be critical thinkers and evaluate the source and consider all the aspects before making the
Right.
decision. And a person who isn't taught or exposed to those critical thinking skills is not going to be a contributing member of our democracy.
I think that's right.
That's great.
And he does. I mean, throughout the book, what I thought was very interesting is the amount of data he brings in, and this is the point I made earlier about social science. The fact of the matter was that he doesn't make, he philosophizes and he comes up with, he has a wonderful way with language, clearly, which is one reason why I was reading some of these passages. Just the musicality of the words really capture one, I think. But he is one who says the hard and cold facts first. We need to know before we can understand. And much of what he debunked about the work of others and his critics was that they would argue without evidence. And I think that is something that is very much part of what we are dealing with now. If we look at the state of our media, the state of our public debate, so many of the discussions are no longer fact-based, evidence-based dialogues, but simply a reflection and echo of opinions that we have heard. And I'm editorializing here, but I am off the clock as dean, so I will express my personal opinion. But I wonder, how do we get back to that Du Boisian linkage of social science and passion? Catherine?
Well, I actually had a question,
Yeah.
and it isn't totally related to this, but I
Yes.
really have been asking this since I read the book again. He died the day before the March on Washington.
Yes.
And I was on that march, and I had no contact, I had never heard of Du Bois, and nobody talked about him, he wasn't taught in high school. And I wondered if he left the country when the civil rights movement was really building up. Why did he leave? If this was did he think it was not what he wanted? I wondered if anyone
Yeah.
knows something about Du Bois.
Well,
Who
it's-
knows whether what his reason
Yeah.
was for abandoning the country just when it was really asserting the kinds of things you would have thought he was promoting.
So there were, I think, several, and I welcome any other ideas, but what I have read, there are actually several reasons. One is he had become a Marxist, and he had moved far away from the talented 10th and had become disillusioned with what he thought of as an elitist elitist society, that we were not, that was not the solution, and that there was too much accommodation going on. And he also is, in your handouts, I've included a chronology which gives you a better sense of what happened. And he, he was one of the founders of the NAACP. And he served for a long time as its secretary and in various other capacities and on the board. And then essentially was fired from that position, only to come back again in the 40s. He came back again in a leadership role and left essentially in disgust because there was a fundamental disagreement between him and others who were in the leadership of the NAACP. And at that point, I think he already, by the time he left, he was 93, I think, or he was in his 90s. I think at that point he just wasn't prepared to wait around any longer to see if any of that would change. But other thoughts on that, please?
I don't know if it's fair to say he left as the civil rights movement was beginning.
Yes.
In many respects, he was a very major advocate for civil rights all of his life.
Yes.
And through all of his
Yes.
writings. And I think the fact that there are people that don't know him that well. I first read this book in college and reread it for tonight, and it was like reading it on a totally different level.
Yeah.
So many levels there. Not only has the world changed, but I've changed as well. And so many of the things that he spoke to are still the issues in debate today, such as the one you're bringing up on education versus training.
Yeah. And what was it that, when you reread it, how did you, were there things that you thought, well, I didn't remember it that way, or things that you might have agreed with then that you no longer shared, or now share views that you might not have shared then?
I think the most interesting thing in my rereading this was his discussion of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yes.
And Reconstruction, and the monumentally impossible task.
Yes.
And then the details give to that, not only the social and the protection and the civil, everything that this bureau was supposed to do. And it struck a chord so many years later in terms of what the task before then was, and how at the time so impossible in terms of where that bureau was positioned and the support they had.
And where he, in fact, argued, I can't, because I don't have my own copy here, but he has this wonderful passage where he said, if it had not been for all of the constraints and restrictions imposed around the Freedmen's Bureau, we might, in fact, have had a national education system long before before the 1954 decision of Brown v. Education. We would have had a common system. We would have had much more equal opportunity if the Freedmen's Bureau had been allowed to do its job for which it had been set up, but was fundamentally prohibited from doing.
I wanted to say a word more about his self-exile
Yes.
to Ghana. I mean, over all this period, and of course it was pretty active civil rights activity, there was a heavy overlay of political oppression, and Dr. Du Bois was roundly castigated as a communist, and he was really vilified, and there was that kind of conservative aspect of NAACP, which was against him at that time too. So I think he just decided to leave.
Right.
Following the Supreme Court decision, which gave Paul Robeson back his passport and all,
Yes.
I think that was a factor in in the notion that he had an ability to travel. I wanted to ask a question, though, in your opinion. So, Dr. Du Bois and M.L. King were contemporaries. I mean, he was a much older man,
Yes.
and I don't think M.L. King ever studied when Du Bois was at Morehouse.
I mean, no, they would
But
not have
My
overlapped.
question
but-
is, and I'm pretty sure that Daddy King and Du Bois were oppositional figures.
Yeah,
Perhaps not, I'm not sure.
I don't know.
But in your opinion, how was M.L. King influenced by W.E.B. Du Bois?
Boy, that probably extends beyond my knowledge. And I would say that I'm probably not well equipped to really answer that question. What I have read in trying to prepare for this talk is that virtually every civil rights leader, and I do want to come back to a comment that you made, which is, the civil rights movement started long before 1963. And in fact, many of the true leaders who we now don't remember anymore were much more prominent than Martin Luther King, Dr. King. So I think that he probably would have been influenced by a collective. But one of the interesting themes that runs through all of Du Bois's writing and his experience, even when you read his autobiography about his experience, for example, in Germany. One reason he really appreciated his life in Germany and would have wanted to return, he just did not have the opportunity later, was the sense of order and decorum that he thought was absent in American life. And even though some would have argued, well, it was also a time when we had the early rise of fascism, and he seems to be singularly silent on that, that these were trends that he was willing to ignore because he had put in some ways, the esoteric above the day-to-day upheavals that he had to face. And if you think about Dr. King's process, he was far less radical than many of his compatriots at that time. I mean, one reason why we perhaps still celebrate or primarily celebrate Dr. King now is that he became an inclusive figure in ways that others who were the path breakers and who burned the ways, literally in some cases, for other leaders to come behind, that he was not like that. He largely was conciliatory, even in his calls to action and his calls for civil rights. And Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, I think, was very similar in the balance that he sought to strike. It was later in life that he became more and more radicalized, but certainly at the time when he wrote Souls of Black Folk, it was very much about, well, we don't want to go as far as Booker T. Washington in being an accommodationist, as he was referred to, but we also need to keep balance. We should be standing above race. We should be thinking about the whole human. And that, some could argue, was what really was the theme, the idea that carried forward into Dr. King's work as well.
Exactly.
So, yes, you have.
I just want to follow up on in terms of the alienation of Du Bois, in that the Justice Department pressed charges of subversive activity against him, and there was going to be a trial in New York City.
If he didn't leave, yeah.
Einstein was asked by Du Bois to testify in that trial, and then the trial was cut short, and Einstein didn't testify. But all of this experience was a humiliation for Du Bois, and I think it really,
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a straw that broke the camel's back, but it was an important reason why he left.
Well, and in fact, you're right. I mean, House Committee on Un-American Activities was going full force at that time, and so anyone who would have expressed the views that Dr. Du Bois had at that time, I can imagine, would end up in crosshairs with that group of folks. Yes, please.
To comment on, I guess, the question raised about the relation to MLK and Du Bois. Typically, when people do the comparison to the major civil rights leaders, people pair someone like Malcolm X with W.E.B. Du Bois and MLK with Booker T. Washington's ideology, in the sense that more so Malcolm X was along the lines of W.E.B. Du Bois when he was saying that there should be black businesses and black people should take up leadership positions in their own societies. And so it wasn't necessarily to the extreme of let's separate ourselves completely and go along the lines of a Marcus Garvey ideology, but it was more so in the respect of MLK would say something similar to like, if you're going to be a street sweeper, be the best street sweeper that you can. That's similar to
Booker T. Washington.
When he's like, cast down your buckets where you are and make yourself economically indispensable to the larger society. So I think that's where the comparison is there. But to the larger question of what is the role of, I guess, higher education in today's society, I think that there are two major narratives that are going on as far as like kids now coming out of high school. I'm a sophomore this year. And they say that college isn't for everybody, and then there is the vocational path, but it's like, if you choose not to go to college, your options for your future are severely limited. And in a culture like an American culture that praises academics and people who go on to have very affluent, wealthy lives, are we sending mixed signals? Like, what is it that we want for our young people to be able to pursue in this new society?
Absolutely. It is one, I'll put in a little plug for my own school here, the School of Professional and Extended Studies. One of the missions that we have is actually to figure out how to straighten out those mixed messages and to make the same argument that Dr. Du Bois did, which is to say we should be doing both. It is not an option, it's not a choice. We can't say we are creating individuals and training individuals simply for a career or a job, providing them with a vocational experience. At the same time, if we were to say, well, all you need to do is enrich yourself with knowledge, and it's knowledge for knowledge's sake, that would be irresponsible of us. So we feel very strongly that we need to have what my colleague Don Blahoviak has referred to as knowledge in action, that we need to find the linkages between understanding a problem and then being able to do something about it, to be able to do that creative problem solving. And I think that's in many ways the message that we should be taking away from Dr. Du Bois at this point.
Well, we learn to think in terms of either or, compare and contrast, and I really think that Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois had more in common than people are willing to really say. It's just too easy to put them on opposite sides. So like the story you said about drop your buckets where you are, I heard that story as if you're in a ship that's in the South Seas and you've lost your power and people are very sick and they're out of water, and then another ship goes by on its own power and they say, help, help, help. And the guy at the other ship says, drop your buckets. And they say, what do you mean? It's going to be salt water. We're not going to drink. So they dropped their buckets, and it was fresh water. And what that meant was that you don't always know where you are, and they were in the mouth of the Amazon where it was fresh water. So you don't always know where you are, so it never hurts to drop your buckets, which is a much more positive thing than to say drop your buckets where you are and put up with being whatever it is that you get, which was a much more positive, hopeful message from Washington. And I think that Martin Luther King became much more like Du Bois at the end of his life. And that was in exactly 1 year to the day before he was killed. He stood at Riverside Church in New York and opposed the Vietnam War. And it was the first time he left the establishment and the elite in Washington that he was so associated with. And that was a huge risk. And that was very radical in a protest.
I think that's, and one additional point I would make there is that we all evolve and we all change over time. And I think one of the interesting echoes that I hear through all of these stories is that people had held a set of beliefs that changed and evolved over time, just as we are changing our reading of souls over time. But even if you think about our current president, he was a community organizer. He began, his political roots are in a very different place, and we don't know what will happen down the road. Who knows? Much of it may also have to do with the context. And for W.E.B. Du Bois, I think it was also, he looked up to Booker T. Washington for much of his early life. Booker T. Washington was a more senior leader and compatriot. And he admired him also for the tenacity that he had in pushing through the single-mindedness, the focus that he had in creating Tuskegee. He said that would not have been doable. Now, he disagreed with the outlook and what he did with it, but again, his radicalization, I think, took a lifetime. It was almost a century worth of experiences that truly radicalized him.
I had a technical question about a date, which was you said
yes.
he got his PhD in 1885 from Harvard?
I think it's 1895. 1895. Sorry, no. Yes, no, 1895. My apologize. And that's why I gave you the handout too, because I'm terrible with dates. Please.
I wanted to respond to your observation that we need to tie liberal arts within economic value to be able to combine the training with the thinking, if you will. And I was trying to figure out how my brain that would work, and I came to thinking, no, there is economic training, there is training to do something. You know, professional schools do that. You are trained to think like a lawyer, to think like a doctor, to think like an economist. You are trained to think in certain prescribed methods. But liberal arts trains you to think, as Du Bois said, as a human.
Yes.
And they're not the same. And
Oh, no, not at all.
that they're not, that the liberal arts isn't valuable if they do not contribute to your economic contribution.
Yeah.
Because you can't, the whole point of the economic contribution is to create a society.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have humans in that society who understand how to be empathetic, which is what the liberal arts do, to understand how to communicate, how to create community, then all of the economic value is not worth very much.
I did not mean, that may have been a I may have misspoken, but I did not equate it with economic value. What I would argue is that there is a place for liberal arts in the real world. We cannot, the ivory tower notion of a university that is separated from the society in which we then have to act is one that certainly in this day and age is a very difficult one to uphold. And I think that what we are, I think we're actually saying the same thing, which is you need the liberal arts to be able to expand and to see the larger connections, the implications of life as a whole, and then you make different value assessments along the way. What I would be concerned about is if we were to say at some point, if as long as smart people all will do just fine economically. That we've known is, yes, it can happen. I landed on my feet most of the time. I started out as a fine arts major until I got kicked out of the fine arts program for lack of talent. Was definitely not one of the talented 10th. But I think we have a responsibility as educators to make sure that we are providing some kind of life path. It doesn't have to be an economically dependent or determined path, but there has to be a way for an individual to have a productive life after they leave a college or a university that is of their own choosing. I mean, if you decide to go and live in a commune and farm mushrooms, or who knows what, become an artist with potentially absolutely no prospect of ever making enough money. That's not the point. You are making a productive contribution to your community, to your society, and you're connecting, and you should be engaging with it. I mean, one of the messages that I think is so powerful about Dr. Du Bois is the fact that we should be thinking about our civil rights. We should be thinking, we have a responsibility that comes with citizenship. And even if you are a liberal arts student, you still have that same responsibility. We are accountable to the larger good. And that's something I think we should be thinking about when we think about this connection of practice and thought, if you will. Other thoughts? Comments? Nancy?
I wanted to make a suggestion about further reading for those of you
Yes.
who want to do a bit more on Du Bois. And there's a Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of him,
Yes.
written by David Levering Lewis.
Yes.
David does incredible scholarship and has twice won the Pulitzer Prize for his biographies. And I know him more socially. His wife was one of my colleagues at the Library of Congress. And so he would come frequently, so she could rope him in, to give staff talks at LC as well as public engagement. And his writing of Du Bois is both intimate and scholarly, because he knows him so well from studying his writing, studying the period, studying letters, correspondence, everything about him, that it will give you another set of appreciations for it. My second one is that all of what we read about in this book from the Freedmen's Bureau was in some ways very eye-opening for me, because when you study it as a student, you get that top paragraph and maybe the second couple paragraphs, and here you got 4 or 5 chapters on the personalities, the differences, the politics of what could have been, in a couple of different instances, what could have been, and in some cases was rather venal in the way that things turned out. The papers of the Freedmen's Bureau are held by the University of Maryland.
That's right.
And there's a whole series of books that have been published where they don't do all of the papers, but they do a selection of papers and then commission scholarly essays to look at the very specific pieces that have been selected, put them in context historically, and then really dig into those pieces. And I recommend them to you. They're highly readable, but help to, again, interpret all the variety of ways that things could have gone.
There also is another wonderful collection of his letters and biographies by actually a contemporary of his, Herbert Aptheker. You can always read it and think there should be another vowel in there somewhere. And in fact, the library here holds those, except I have them checked out right now. But and it is an interesting. They had an interesting relationship because they did actually. They corresponded. They overlapped. They knew each other. And he became essentially the court biographer of Du Bois and his companion in writing. And it's interesting to look at the relationship that they had with one another. And I think what is interesting to me is that W.B. Du Bois, even though he makes this big deal out of the veil and the color line, and certainly held very true to the importance of understanding and giving credit and light to Black life in America, that he himself was singularly oblivious and felt it was irrelevant to his life in many ways what color your skin was. It mattered more what you had to say and what you thought. And if you look at the photographs of him and many of his contemporaries, he's in these very mixed groups with all kinds. I mean, it is truly a multicultural setting and society in a way that I think was highly unusual at that time. So, that's right, and even, I mean, he was involved with the United Nations, and many of those, just as Rusk had also been involved in. These were individuals who simply who were not defined by their color, and I think that was an important message for him to be able to carry forward also. Don.
Dr. Weil, I wanted to come back to the temptation of polarity of humanity or technical education
Yes.
for a second. When you mention med schools or many of the other more professional schools, I think it is worth noting, given the themes of the evening, that many of those professional trade schools, if you will, have re-injected humanities into their curriculum quite intentionally, because without that, we have found, I think, as a society, particularly in the United States, that you quickly move to a technocracy which is soulless, and that is not good for us. Yes. So, for example, medical schools are now introducing personal communication and sensitivity, empathy training to medical students.
Holistic medicine, very much part of
schools,
that. Yeah.
There is not just how to do market research in the global economy, but we send students abroad to live there, not to understand the market, but to understand people who live differently. Yes. And in all these professions, there's reintroduction of ethics and humanity kind of themes, because we don't want to live in a soulless society. So you mentioned Hegel and dialectic. Yes. I think we are finding that education is not polarity, it is much more dialectic. And we would do ourselves a disservice to try and separate these things. Right. We really want to integrate, not separate.
I think that's very well. And I would add one more aspect, which is accountability. That we owe it to ourselves, and that one of the things that this kind of integrated education allows us to do is to hold us accountable as well as others to higher standards. And that is also a theme that comes throughout W.B. Du Bois, that you don't settle, but you also, you account, you hold others accountable as well as yourself, so, yes.
Although he would have been considerably younger, what was the intersection between Du Bois and Frederick Douglass?
There was, but I'm afraid I don't know how much. I mean, they clearly, obviously, he was a follower. And when he describes the Freedmen's Bureau, he talks about the origins of Freedmen's Bureau were very much shaped by Frederick Douglass, as were the abolitionist papers. When you read those, I mean, it's very much a function of the leadership that Dr. Douglass brought to that era of history. I don't know that they had, other than as public intellectuals, there were certainly exchanges, and he clearly was a follower of Frederick Douglass, but I don't know that they had that much interaction. Du Bois had much of his teaching was in Atlanta. He spent time well, there and then in Massachusetts also. So he kept going back and forth between Atlanta and Massachusetts. One of the interesting facets, I think, that distinguishes Dr. Du Bois from many of the other leaders was the fact that he was a Northerner. He was not a Southerner. He was first generation. His father was Jamaican, I believe. And so he had a very different experience than many of those who had come before him, including Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass also, in thinking about their place in society. So, but I would need to read up much more. It's a great question, though. Thank you. Steve.
Just want to make a couple of comments. I agree with both of these people on books that you should read. And I want to recommend that you continue, or if you follow up in this area, you look into reading it from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, as
Yes.
well as the other books you wrote. And then you will get a sense that even though they moved from Boston to Mississippi, it was the black community back at that time was very tight and very small.
Yes.
Especially the successful ones. And if Booker T. Washington came to Washington from Montgomery, Alabama, and Tuskegee, he wasn't exactly staying at Marriott's. He would be staying at, in North Carolina, maybe with John Merrick or with Simon
Right.
Hopkins or whatever. So it was a very tight community. These people knew each other. And if you think about the 12-year age difference between Booker T. Washington and Bois, Booker T. Washington was living in the Black Belt. Tuskegee was 30 minutes outside of Montgomery, Alabama, which may be an influence of why Martin Luther King,
Yeah.
next street in Montgomery, would know about Booker T. Washington. But Reconstruction was dying. The Jim Crow era was picking up. Lynching was on the rise, and the compromise was, some people theorized, was a way to settle down things.
Right.
And bring some stability to that area back then at that time. I don't know if Du Bois ever got below Atlanta or Fisk and Nashville, but he never saw that black belt of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, etc., like Washington did. And I think it makes a difference how you have to read these two books.
Absolutely.
They weren't that far apart.
No.
They really weren't.
And they
In
acknowledge,
chapter
he acknowledges
four,
that.
Chapter 4, he said it was
Yes.
a stepping stone
Absolutely.
to
Yes.
university education.
Yes.
You had to have that vocation. And then I cross over to what he said, and I'm wondering, what is going to be the value of a BA degree as we become more involved with technology? And all of a sudden, we have to press a button with a BA degree to start a computer to run the robotics, making the next car coming down the line. It's the vocational sort of, modern term coming together with the general academic discussion here.
Well, I think certainly what we have found is that a computer is only, and most technology will only be as good as the information and the input that went into it, and that's where the human mind comes into play and where the significance of human accomplishment will never go away. Yes, you can have automated, self-automated assembly lines, and we can all have our robots doing things. We have all my smart devices that are supposedly smarter than I am. At the end of the day, it's all about what information I choose to store in those smart devices and how well they will serve my life. I mean, I don't think that we have we have not upended the order of things, if you will, and the technology is still dependent and subservient to the minds that create it, and so a BA will continue to be the first the first line of defense in many ways.
Well,
It's,
the
I
point
think,
too is
yeah.
that, if I'm following a little bit more along, there really won't be those jobs in between. And I think that's part of the reason for the emphasis on the higher education. I mean, if you don't have that BA, you don't go in through the front door, period. And because in fact we've lost a lot of that part because of the advances in technology. The opportunities for some of our college students, it's the young lady that was talking, they've got to go to college.
Yeah.
Because there aren't those other jobs out there in the vocational area that are going to be anything other than maybe an okay second income.
Sure.
But not something that's going to be a livelihood for a family or the rest of them. These kids need the education.
I think one of my colleagues sitting over here can I hope confirm this, that one of the first things we've seen in librarianship is all of the easy questions are gone. You can answer those on Google. We don't have to sell bar bets anymore. We don't have to do any of that kind of stuff. You can do it yourself. What's left is the hard stuff. And I think you're making the same point, that what's left in just about any profession is the hard stuff. And what employers tell us they want from a fresh college graduate are people who can think, people who can learn, people who can speak, and people who can write.
Of course, they've got to look
I mean, and it sounds like those are basic skills, but it is a professional skill set wrapped around the ability to learn, and that's what they learn here.
And I would say that, as someone who is a product of a very traditional liberal arts education in undergraduate, when people ask me, well, what did you take away from your years in a liberal arts, small women's liberal arts college, I say I learned how to ask questions. If nothing else, I know I can always land on my feet because I can ask a question. And the more complex the reasoning is required, then of course you go back to school, we continue to do the lifelong learning, which is how we now think of ourselves exactly. And we ask each other questions. And but I think it's also, to your point, I'm sorry I don't know your name, but I wonder whether we can really say that all that stuff in between just goes away, because what we're finding is there's more of an overlap.
And my point was literally the jobs. The kids now absolutely are going to have to. I was agreeing with the young woman who was back before. The big divide between vocational training and an academic training is
moot.
It's huge now, because really the kind of vocational, the traditional, the secretarial course or the mechanics course is really going to, some of that stuff just isn't even there anymore. So I think it's more and more important that, kind of going along with what President Obama was talking about, it's more and more important that the lower economic strata can get that college education, because otherwise it's really tough to move on.
But I would argue that even in part, the college education allows us to think about simple solutions. And that what we're finding in some parts of the world, in fact, that we go low tech again. And if you think about the back to the land movements, organic farming, think about any of the things that we see now as being part of our quality of life. Quality of life is defined in some cases by the absence of technology or the absence of complexity. But you need that higher learning and that higher education in some cases to be able to distill and discern what the simple solution is.
I just wanted to make a plug for fiction.
Yes, please.
I feel that this is fantastic and it's a great discussion.
Thank you.
But I also feel that sometimes fiction is more true than facts and research. So there were two great novels that I loved that I would love to just share. One is called The Cheneyville Incident. I don't know if you've read that.
I have not,
By David Bradley. It was written in 1981. And he's an African-American PhD student who's married to a white woman psychiatrist. south Kentucky to find his father and grandfather and their roots. It's an incredible book.
Great.
So powerful and so well written. And the other book that was written by, much more recently, by a white man who was a big researcher, I think, although he was a great writer, named Richard Powers, is that his name? Richard Powers, is called The Time of Our Singing, which is a huge novel about two people who meet at Marian Anderson's concert on the Mall of
Great.
an African-American woman and a white Jewish immigrant who's a scientist, and about their relationship all the way through to the present day and their children and grandchildren. It's a fantastic book.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Those are wonderful
With
suggestions.
that, can we thank Carola? for
Thank you.
joining us
Thank
tonight?
you.
And this is starting to work out like a book club is supposed to. We talk about the one here, and we start making recommendations to each other about more to read, whether it is the science, the fiction, the nonfiction part of all of it. And I hope that you will all come back next month. Probably continue this part of the discussion as we move into James Baldwin's book. And to your point that fiction is one of the great ways to learn these kinds of stories, the book that will be led for us in April is being led by Patrick Jackson, Assistant Dean of SIS, who teaches a course that alternates between social science and science fiction.
Oh, great.
On the same subject matter, working its way back and forth. So I think you'll particularly welcome him as leading the discussion. So thank you all for coming. We'll thank Carola again and pick up.
Thank you.